Hello and welcome to Hours of Harbour for July. It is, well, I'm back from China. It is still winter here in Sydney, which means that it gets very dark very early. Right now it's only 6 o'clock, but it looks a lot later than that. We've got the Hours of Harbour night mode right now. We've only got really 5 books. I got 4 here, but one was an ebook. And so I managed to get a few larger texts done this month since I've been in China, been able to finish books that I normally wouldn't. So this has been interesting. I think when books get to a certain length, you get to avoid the whole hero's journey kind of structure and can spend more time really with the life of a character. So that's what each of these have been doing. Yeah, things are good. Things are good. I can't really say much other than that. The Lord of the Rings video was fun. I released that maybe 2 or 3 days before I was supposed to leave for China, and I'd already pre-recorded the June Hours of Harbour, so I had no time to respond to that. I'm just not gonna really address it. I think I looked back at it because I was really surprised at how much response and, I guess, rebuttal that video got, and I guess it was very silly of me to title it that. I do think that in retrospect. But I also went back and watched it, and I kind of stand by most of the points that I have. I'm not someone who's an enormous fan of fantasy, and I think the point that I made was that for a book like that to be so lifted up as the #1 fantasy book for now and forever, I think was just a little bit of an overreach. I still think it's a great book. I still think it's a very worthwhile read. Maybe the nuance was lost there. Anyways, let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about book #1 is A Confederacy of Dunces. So this was my Make Me Laugh for this month. A picaresque novel, and I'm only slowly starting to learn what this term means. So a picaresque novel is more about a character than a overall plot. It's about a person who doesn't really fit in their society and is able to either subvert the world around them or kind of fall prey to the kind of social cues and more bureaucratic things that exist around them. And we follow Ignatius C. Riley, who's a man in his 30s, a very ineffective man in New Orleans. He's someone who is extremely well educated, loves reading the classics, loves translating things from ancient Greek, knows philosophy, knows theory, and yet just doesn't really succeed as a human being. So he can't find a job, he can't take responsibility for himself, he lives with his mother, and it's kind of that stereotypical sad person living in their basement. This book actually was written in the 1960s and only got published in the 1980s after the death of its author. And it's one of those really rare stories where someone's written a full novel and it winds up in the hands of a very powerful editor. In this case, I think it's Walker Percy, the person who wrote The Moviegoer. Yeah, Walker Percy, who really championed this novel after the author's mother actually submitted it on his behalf after his passing. So it then really took off. I think the comedy of this novel feels surprisingly modern. So what I see people talking about this novel, they describe the main character as if he's someone who'd be on Reddit quite a lot. So it's someone who has strong opinions on things, but also, I guess, doesn't necessarily live them out. He's very vocal, very, I guess, divisive as a person, and the author does this really great job of striking a balance between making him kind of sad and fun to laugh at, but also someone that you feel a little bit of sympathy for. Like, I don't feel like as I read this book that we're just beating up on this guy all the time. Instead, we do have these kind of little wry moments that we laugh at how silly the world is, that it can't really fully accept someone like Ignatius Riley. And he finds himself in these really silly situations. He finds himself arrested at the start of the novel by this police officer named Mancuso, who's just a bizarre character. Like, he goes undercover wearing these ridiculous costumes, and he just is not expected to arrest anybody. And we see just the absolute absurdity of life in the 1960s in New Orleans, with all of its larger-than-life characters in this text. I think it actually does succeed in being quite funny. There are moments that I genuinely did laugh out quite a lot because it's just full of motifs, it's full of callbacks, it's full of characters that are consistent. It's just this absolute mess of things. And to me, I feel like this is quite influential to modern American comedy in that it's built on consistent characters, but it also has this nice little running thread of absurdism that's not entirely mean-spirited. Instead, we kind of laugh along with these characters, and we see how silly the world is, and at the end of the day, the consequences are not heavy. And for what it's worth, I think this novel works really well. I think technically, as a comic novel, it's really impressive. It's actually quite worth studying, in my opinion. The only thing that I would raise too is just, if you were to look at criticism of this book today, you would engage with its kind of problematic attitudes towards race relations, and I don't disagree. I do think it does have some of its own problematic moments. Having been written with the values of the 1960s and 70s, is not great, right? It's not amazing, and there's some moments that I kind of frown at. But again, the way that the author has written this, it doesn't beat up on anybody. It doesn't make anybody the butt of a joke. Or if it does, it's Ignatius Reilly, and he kind of deserves it. He kind of brings it upon himself, right? Like, at no point do I feel mean-spirited when I laugh in this text. And so it does make those kind of pricklier moments a bit more easy to forgive. Look, the intention of this novel is not to address race or at least make fun of race. It includes these characters that you could argue as racial caricatures in a way to reflect ordinary life in New Orleans and the attitude that people had towards that. It's not great, like it's not something that's going to save the world, but if you take this as a light novel and something that is really just kind of poking fun at everything in culture at the time, I think it works pretty well. I enjoyed it, and I was surprised at how much I did enjoy it. I think satires don't really get me. Stories about these kinds of unsuccessful narrators or unsuccessful main characters, to me, I don't always love them. To me, I tend to like comedy that's a bit more situational than it is based on laughing at characters and stereotypes. But I think this one does it quite well. I have fond memories of it, so I give it a 4 out of 5. Book number 2, this is my series finisher, and I absolutely raced through this. This is The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. It's the third book in the, what's it called? The Historic Materials trilogy. And the premise of this book really just kind of goes off the rails with this series. So we began with Northern Lights, or the Golden Compass, depending on where you live, which is set in this steampunky alternate reality where theologians are the scientists, and they discover this magical power, invisible thing called dust around the world, and they also discover that they can travel between alternate realities. Meanwhile, in their alternate reality, everybody has their demon, so it's this entity that they can control. It looks like an animal, and it can influence the world around them. We follow Lyra, who's a young girl growing up in Oxford College, and she's trying to uncover this big mystery of what is the church trying to hide in its study of theology and its study of the world and really physics. So Northern Lights was a fantastic read. It was a really enjoyable young adult book, and it had great characters, great world building, set apart from fantasy tradition. It was not familiar to me at all. In fact, it was feeling like the author was drawing upon new ground and drawing upon different modes of creating fantastical worlds rather than just the standard swords and sorcery, dragons and elves and everything, right? I thought that was really refreshing. And then book 2 hit. Book 2 was the Subtle Knife, and that's the one where they start hopping between worlds. We also sort of switch narrators to Will, who is a young boy from, I guess, the real world, and he starts by inheriting this weapon that can cut holes through the fabric of reality so it can slip in between these different worlds. The Subtle Knife also kind of builds towards the foreshadowing of a giant war, and The Amber Spyglass is really the aftermath of that. So this is the third book and the final book in the trilogy. I think there is actually a fourth one that fills in some things. But we find out that the war is really between the authority figure, who in this book's universe is kind of like the Abrahamic God, the person who created the world and has angels that serve them and all of these things. And it's suggested that this authority figure is someone who can control everything across all the different multiverses, and their strongest angel is named Metatron, who is this really big, fearsome entity all across the novel. The characters are kind of always escaping from and plotting a way to overcome. This is interesting because it's not biblical. So Metatron comes from the Book of Enoch, which is a very well-known apocryphal book that's not in, I don't think it's in any canonical Bible or Hebrew text. I don't think it is. I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. But it is a very old text. I think it was found within the Dead Sea Scrolls along with some of the prophets. So it is known from that era, and that book tells the story of Enoch, who was mentioned in the book of Genesis, and then he goes on to become an angel named Metatron. It kind of builds upon that. And I think it's interesting. I think The idea of taking on organized religion in this series becomes much more pronounced in this book. It is much more direct about the way that it addresses churches and saints and religious quests and creator figures and all of that. I think it's quite pessimistic towards the idea of organized religion, and it's quite humanistic to its representation of individual people, of free will, of good and bad that comes from the individual human rather than from an external kind of creator figure. All those ideas are kind of interesting, and I get a sense that this book in one sense is trying to be more philosophical, but it is also trying to be the big dramatic culmination of this foreshadowing war story between angels and humans, and that part of it to me didn't work quite as well. So I find that for the third book in the series, it really is introducing a lot of new things. It's introducing new worlds and new ways of traveling between the worlds, new fantastical concepts. I was going to say scientific concepts, but really it's kind of things that the characters discover that they can do. And we have Will and Lyra in the middle of all of this, who are very much and very believably teenagers or young adults. Like, they're 12 and 13 in this book. They don't have the critical thinking, so they're kind of just pawns in the adults' game of trying to fight against God. And the kids are just kind of running around with the most powerful objects in existence. So Lyra is running around with the altheometer, which can just tell the truth in this kind of weird predestinational way. And Will is running around with this subtle knife, which can just cut holes in reality. And all the other characters are trying to play around the fact that these two kids suddenly have the most powerful artifacts in the universe. Like, it's weird. It's trying to keep itself together when really it's this big mishmash of really messy things. And in some ways the messiness is what's really endearing about this novel. It's not something that feels so carefully planned and focus grouped that it will appeal to certain audiences. It doesn't feel very commercial. Instead, it's just chaotic. Like, you really, really don't know what's going to happen next just because of how bizarre and alien it all is. I also think that the plot is very kinetic. It keeps pushing forward, sometimes in a bad way. Sometimes I do find that coincidences and meetings are just a little bit too neat. Characters are exactly where they are, where they need to be at exactly the right time. They have exactly the right thing. They have exactly the right ability. If you give a moment of thought, then sometimes it feels weird. Like, why don't these really powerful characters kill or detain the characters that cause them problems? And it's usually just, oh, it wouldn't make sense for them to do that at this point in the story. And at the end of the text, I did also feel like the stakes that were built up really, really high of this war between angels and demons and God and humans, it just didn't have the gravity that I was hoping it would have, which I guess it's hard. I guess it's really, really hard to make that payoff work. But really, it's the consequences of the choices made across the series is that I think the building of this world is really rich and fantastical, and the payoff and resolution of this world can never really reach that same level of loftiness. I think it's just the consequence of this style of storytelling. So I didn't love it, I'll be honest. It's not my favorite conclusion to a fantasy series, but I also don't really know what the author could have done in this situation. I think it started out so ambitious and so unique and different, and really, what was there to do, right? So I would give it a 3 out of 5, but I think that Northern Lights, as a standalone, is a fantastic book. That's a great start, and if they fall in love with the series, they can keep going if they want, but I'm not sure if this ever reaches the same kind of heights as the beginning. And it's funny too, because everything I've read about the series does suggest that the last book is just not as strong as the rest. I was hoping that I could, argue against that, but here I am saying exactly the same as what everyone else is saying. It's good, it's good, it's good. It's just not amazing. Book number 3, this is my Booker Prize winner, Wolf Hall, where Hilary Mantel won the Booker Prize in what year? Booker Prize 2009. Massive book and massive series. This book, which is 625 pages, is the first in a series of 3 books that are about as long. So this is about the Tudor dynasty, and historical fiction is always a bit difficult, especially with this one, because the period of history is just so specific and kind of niche. I don't know how many people would have the interests that Hilary Mantel does, or the scope of this novel does. So it's set in the late 1500s during the reign of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII is that kind of mythical figure that people know very briefly about. He formed the Church of England. He wanted to divorce his wife. He didn't have a male heir. Instead had Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth ended up becoming one of the most stable rulers of all of English history. But before that, we have this character who is kind of maligned in history as this very hedonistic figure who wanted something and would destroy kingdoms in order to get it. And in Wolf Hall, we follow Thomas Cromwell, who eventually becomes the advisor to the king. But we look at his rise into the courts in this book. We look at the way that he, at first, serves the cardinal, and the way that the Catholic cardinal ends up in this really difficult position when Henry VIII wants to break away from the Catholic Church. What that really means, the role of Anne Boleyn, all of these different characters that have various amounts of power within the within the English court, and how a person like Thomas Cromwell is able to manipulate and schmooze his way up through the ranks in order to get himself to a position where he is very influential with the king. It's a bit hard to understand. I'm saying this as someone who does know the history a little bit, so I have been teaching English, or high school English, for a while. That means that I've been able to teach the Shakespeare plays Henry IV and Henry V and Richard III, and over the course of history I kind of know what the royal family was building to. So even on the cover, like this rose, I know what that means, that there's a red rose and a white rose, and that's the uniting of the York and Lancaster families at the end of the War of the Roses. That represents the Tudor house, which was designed to bring back stability to England after this long civil war. Like, I got that, right? And that's something that the book tries to make you understand with all these family trees and with these list of characters. Like, the list of characters is 3 pages long, and that's not even every named character in the book. Like, it's pretty complicated. It doesn't help also that lots of people have the same name in the historical record. If you're reading this book, there are at least 3 Thomases that are plot relevant, at least 3 Annes that are plot relevant. They try their best to delineate these characters, but sometimes it's just not possible, and sometimes you will just get confused, and that's part of the joy of reading historical fiction. This is also really intertwined with the history of the Church Reformation in England. So it's around the time of the Protestant Reformation in Germany and Switzerland, led by Martin Luther. And the interesting overlap between Church Reformation in England and the breaking away and forming the Anglican Church in England is that Henry VIII was not a Catholic. Like, his faith, from all what we understand in history, very much kind of still followed Catholic traditions, and in this text it reads the historical Thomas Cromwell as secretly a Protestant. So he's someone that is more critical of Catholic beliefs because he himself has read the English Bible, the Tyndale Bible, named after the translator William Tyndale, who in this book also gets killed for either treason or heresy, something like that. Or he's a fugitive, right? He's hunted by the church. And so this book chronicles the changes or the waves in the attitudes that the common people had towards religion, given that it used to be quite state-based. I guess for Henry VIII it is still quite state-based, but previously being Catholic, and then slowly over the course of the novel, people start to become aware of the Protestant Reformation in Germany, and also the very strong efforts that Catholic figures like the Vatican and the Emperor, but also figures like Thomas More, that are trying to quell Protestantism in England. It's complicated. But the thing is, I understood those 2 things just based on my own personal reading and interests. Before reading this text, I was aware of that. It did make this book a bit easier to understand, but I still had a hard time understanding it. So if you are going out of your way to read this, it is worthwhile to do some research. It's worthwhile to at least watch something about that historical period, whether it's like the Hollow Crown or whether it's the Shakespeare plays, something to become aware of the previous War of the Roses between the Yorks and the Lancasters, and then what the Tudor house really means for England, but also about Church Reformation and what it specifically means, the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism in specifically the 1600s, or the 1500s, because that's one of the underlying conflicts with this book. So if you understand the political side of things and the religious side of things, then the stakes of this book then become super duper high. Like, as a political thriller, it's so clear how much pressure all the characters in this book are at all times, because they have so many different loyalties to church, to God, to their king, to their families, to themselves. Everyone's in this really precarious position, and every word they say, anything they do, any person they stand too close to, all of that is part of weaponry or ammunition that somebody else can use against them if they don't like them. And Thomas Cromwell finds himself as someone who is extremely good at manipulating this. So we see everything through his eyes. If something happens and Thomas Cromwell isn't there, then we don't see it. We hear it from someone else, right? Thomas Cromwell is here, present at all times. And what the book does, structurally and in the way that it's told, is that it starts with this chapter that's in Thomas Cromwell's childhood, and it's just him just absolutely getting beaten up by his dad. So this opening scene is powerful and visceral, but the important thing to take away from it too is that it establishes the perspective of the book, which is extremely close, third-person limited. We follow Thomas Cromwell always. We never leave his brain or his thoughts, and we get a lot of free and direct discourse trying to explain the world through his eyes. So we are supposed to get really comfortable with the fact that we're just going to follow him. And every time you see the pronoun he, and it's not explicitly clear who that's referring to, it's probably referring to Thomas Cromwell. It's not written in first person, it doesn't use I, and I think the benefit of doing that means that it can use modern English rather than entirely, I think in this time it even would have been Middle English, right, the 1500s. It's still very easy to understand. The words themselves aren't difficult, but just the themes and the values really are. It strikes this difficult balance between being true to life of this time, but also being engaging to audiences of the current day. And I think that Hilary Mantel's done a pretty good job. Like, people like this book, right? This, I think, was number 3 in New York Times' best books of the 21st century. And I agree, it's good, it's very well researched, and there are times where it really, really had me going. Whether it is just very emotional moments from Thomas Cromwell's life, or whether it is quite dramatic, politically charged moments where I was thinking about my own reflections of morality and power and leadership and spirituality, I think all of that is done quite well. It is a challenging read, but it is also quite rewarding, and it just makes you feel so smart when you read it as well. If you understand what's going on, and you feel a bit like Cromwell trying to puppet master his way through the courts, you just feel so smart. So I would give it a 4 out of 5. I got a lot of it. I really enjoyed my time with it. So recommended, but there is some homework required if you want to get the most out of it. There are now 2 more books in the series that I will probably need to get to. The Bring Up the Bodies, which is the second book, is also a winner of the Booker Prize, so I will probably get to that, if not this year, the next year. And the last one, The Mirror and the Light, was finished before Hilary Mantel's passing. It finishes the trilogy as well, ending with Cromwell's death. I would actually be interested to see historical fiction that goes beyond that as well, because I think the historical periods of Queen Elizabeth and King James would be quite interesting in this same lens and style, looking at church reformation and power dynamics within Renaissance England. But that's maybe asking too much. I still haven't even finished book 2 and 3 of this, and that would be another 1,000 or so pages. Okay, that took a while. This next one's going to be quick. This one is Last Orders by Graham Swift. This is My Make Me Cry. It is also a Booker Prize winner. It won the prize in 1996, and we follow 4 people in a car together where they've been asked as part of Jack Dodds's will, who's passed away, to drive off to the shoreline and to scatter his ashes at the end of the pier into the ocean. So, very simple premise, and yet in this space, we have these 4 characters and also the late Jack Dodds. We see their whole lives all the way through. We see the way that they're influenced by the war. We see the way they try to make a living or make businesses, and we see the consequences of the choices that they make and the way they relate to their families. We see the kinds of often quite damaging relationships they have with the women in their lives, and we see the ways they connect together in their third place. So they all meet together in a pub called The Coach, and they all joke about how it doesn't go anywhere, it's not a coach. But to me, it's a very vernacular novel, and a novel that not idealizes, but just represents in a naturalistic and often quite aestheticized way the lives of ordinary English people, and the way that they recovered from the war, the way they look out for each other, the way they have ups and downs in life, And it does so in retrospect rather than showing a full life story in all of its little moments. Because it's centered around this drive to scatter the ashes, the flashbacks become very targeted. We see these characters and their relationship to each other as older individuals, and when they do jump back to moments of their childhood or their upbringing or their time in the war or their relationships to each other as they grow older, it's done so purposefully to show the connections they have with each other. We don't just have the bare minimum births, deaths, and marriages, although there are lots of each of those. We instead have crystallized moments that show us how these people connect with one another. And each of them is very different, both in their social class, but also their kind of innate personality. So we see them really as full and three-dimensional human beings, and it's quite impressive the way the novel does this for 5 whole people in the space of about 300 pages. Like, it's really quite well done. It's really efficient. And this whole realistic life story is told in retrospect, looking at ideas of memory and adolescence and coming of age and personality and all of that. Like, it's very literary, and it's very Booker Prize-y. I think the Booker Prize has a style, and especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, that style is quite apparent. I've read lots of books that have won the Booker Prize that feel like this. I would say Hotel du Lac, Moon Tiger, what's that other one? Portrait of Remains of the Day. Like, all of these kind of have similar vibes, similar styles. Not that much distinguishes them from one another except the setting and a little bit of the writing style. This one to me feels more vernacular, it feels more ordinary, it still has those sad moments, it still has that playing with time, playing with style that's just a little bit more elevated than normal fiction. It's fine. It's, to be honest, a kind of forgettable Booker Prize winner. I did feel something, though. I did feel quite strongly for these characters, and they do feel quite familiar, and it is a testament to the author's ability that he's able to do that. But I also wonder the extent to which my connection to these characters are because they go through experiences that I've either gone through or I feel like I may go through later in life. Because it's a book about men. It's a book about 4 men and their relationships to each other and their relationships with their respective wives. And playing on the societal attitudes towards men as being stoic and emotionless, as being decisive and ambitious, as being someone who takes control of their life and their circumstances, maybe to me that's something that resonates more than a book like Hotel du Lac, which is more about a feminine rebirth, so to speak. So for Last Orders, like, I like it, it's good, it's a 4 out of 5. I think it's somewhat of a forgettable Booker Prize winner. I don't know if I would rank it very high on the whole list of winners of that, but I can see the skill of the author here, and I did enjoy my time with it. I did get a bit misty, although I didn't cry fully, but I really do see what they're trying to do, and I do think that for its entirety, it's successful. Okay, and the last one, my short story collection. Now this one I read on an ebook, so I don't have the real copy with me, but I will flash it up on the screen. Birds of America by Lorrie Moore. Lorrie Moore is a writer that I really, really enjoy and admire. So she was one of the first short story writers that I read in great detail when I started taking short stories serious myself. So I read I think it was a Lit Hot article on 20 short story writers or collections that teachers of writing would recommend to new students who want to write short fiction. And on those, in that article, I had a lot of names that I now kind of really respect. Lorrie Moore was one of them, Grace Paley, Anton Chekhov, of course, Lydia Davis, Lucia Berlin, a lot of these writers that I really, really respect. And Lorrie Moore is good for 2 things. I think she's really good for her sentence-to-sentence structure. I think the way that she represents human emotion and human behavior is just so unique. Like, she has, sometimes she'll just hit you with a sentence that makes you go, hey, I've never heard it phrased that way, but actually I've been feeling that emotion my whole life. That happens at least once in every story, and I'm actually quite glad that I read an ebook because people would highlight it, and I can see on the Kindle app that there's these little dots on the lines that tell me basically to pay attention because this is really good. And it is really good. It is something that I would highlight too. I would take it out of context, and I would really enjoy how perceptive it is, not just for the characters in that story, but also just for life in general. Like, I think it's just well, it's good. But the other thing that Lorrie Moore's really good for too is just these representations of ordinary reality in this heightened, aestheticized way. Like, she's not an author that is about big situations or big personalities or big characters. Instead, a lot of these stories are very ordinary. They kind of dip in and out of, I'm generalizing here, they dip in and out of the important states like New York and California, and in and out of the more suburban ordinary states like Iowa and New Hampshire. Again, haven't been to most of those states, so I can't really say for sure. But the stereotype I have with this, right, is that these are characters that aren't heroes of their own narrative or of anyone else's narrative. These are characters that are ordinary and that you might ignore. But what the stories do is they elevate up these characters and show them in the most beautiful and ornate and detailed moments of their lives in order to make us connect with them and see actually they're more than just the afterthought that we would have if we passed them on the street, that they are deep and complex and full of these experiences and outlooks in the world that are valuable to us, that we should be interested in everybody. We should see everybody's life and be curious about their loves and their hates, their interests, their upbringings, all the things that make them who they are, because all of that is valuable. And in Birds of America, this comes out quite clearly, because I think a lot of these stories aren't remarkable. Except for one. But most of these stories are quite ordinary. And so what we get out of that is empathy. What we get out of that is we feel love for these people. Like we really see people that we desire to be with and desire to spend time with in some of these characters. And so some of these stories have become some of my favorite of all time. Especially Dance in America. I love that story. I think there's just so many silly things about that story, silly little details that go to make these characters just fully realized in my mind. It's 3,000 words, and it's some of the best writing I've ever seen. And then there's Real Estate. So there is this one really weird story where, actually, is it Real Estate? Possibly two really weird stories. There's one weird story where there's literally 6 pages of just ha 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 over and over again. That one is weird. And it's either the same story or another story that's also weird, where there's just this incredible coincidence. I don't really want to go into such great detail because I also think I might be wrong here. I might have interpreted it incorrectly. But there's this incredible coincidence that makes me think, or reminds me that I'm reading a story. Whereas a lot of these other stories, I don't feel that way. I feel like I'm looking at a snapshot of a real person. So I think at the very beginning we get these little moments of playing with reality. And last year I read her novel, what is it called? I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home. That is a magic realist novel, but it also had these moments of reality. So I like that reading the first collection of short stories from Lorrie Moore. We're seeing this style develop, and we're seeing an unpredictability that will develop hopefully in her later texts as well. So I read this book as part of the collected stories of Lorrie Moore. There's a few other collections in there that are available as well. I'm excited. I really enjoy this, so I would give it a 4 out of 5. Some stories really sing, other stories kind of fall by the wayside, just because I think at the very beginning they do use similar techniques to the point where I can't really tell them fully apart. But in their own value and in their own sense, every individual story is a great trip and a great time. I don't know if I would sit down and read them all in one go, because they do kind of bleed together, and they do have that same pervasive sense of kind of dissatisfaction, ordinary feeling, which is not always a pleasant thing. But by themselves, these are very, very good stories. Okay, that's a pretty good one. So that's my 5-ish books for the month. One more thing that I did this month too was that I read the Iliad and the Odyssey in preparation for reading Ulysses. I didn't actually read any of Ulysses because I wanted to try and give it my best shot, and in order to do that I wanted to get all the intertextual references that it tries to have, and I became aware of the 2 different, I forgot what they're called. You know, the tables. I'll put them on the screen. The tables. The 2 different ways of organizing the Ulysses chapters, and they're organized around the Odyssey, and so I wanted to understand that. I didn't want to be left in the dark. So I did read those 2 epic poems, and I will probably make a separate video because I have a lot to say about them. They're very different to what I thought they would be, and hopefully that will lead into my enjoyment of this big and horrifying book. Okay, thank you for joining, and I will see you soon. I'll see you next month.